Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics. This week we're discussing the career and ideas of Professor Cathy Elliott. This week we have another of our series of occasional life-offs, where we interview our professors on the event of their inaugural lectures about their careers and research. And this time I'm particularly delighted to be joined by Professor Cathy Elliott, our first ever professor on the teaching track in the Department of Political Science and School of Public Policy. She's also the Vice Dean of Education for the Faculty of Social and Historical Sciences here at UCL. So Cathy spent 7 years managing international development projects in various interesting countries for the British Council before her curiosity about, and she says her disillusionment with this work, led her to a PhD in politics here at UCL. And she's been here ever since, challenging and improving our teaching practices and producing fascinating research on both politics and nature, which regular listeners will remember an earlier episode about, which we'll link to, and on teaching in higher education and how we could all do it a lot better. The audience for Cathy's inaugural was filled with both colleagues and former and current students, in a testament to the impact that she has had. So today we're going to be discussing both her innovative teaching practices and experiments in teaching, and her intriguing proposal that what we need to do is transform these rigid, rule-bound universities, a process she describes as rewilding the university. Welcome back to the podcast, Cathy.
Thank you very much.
It's brilliant to have you here. So let's start with your career. It's a bit different to the other new professors we've had on the podcast. And because it's been one so devoted to teaching and to finding your own way through and to making this space for the role that you have now. I wondered if you'd tell our listeners a bit about that experience.
Thank you. So, it's been a very cobbled together career. I came to UCL to do my master's, having already had a career at the British Council, as you've just mentioned. Did my master's, did my PhD. Did quite a lot of teaching during my PhD, which I just loved. And I really felt like when I was teaching, I just came to life. And then after that finished, I started getting these kind of, as lots of people do, I got these kind of temporary teaching jobs here and there. And I was cobbling together the hours. I had a few hours at King's and a few hours at UCL. And eventually that grew into a kind of a 0.8 FTE 9-month contract at UCL, which is at that time was much more common than it is now. But you still see that in the sector quite a lot. And understandably, everybody asked me at the time, how's the job hunt going? Because, people found that didn't sound very sustainable. But I suppose the comparative for me was that I'd been working in the British Council, where every 3 years you packed up all your stuff and you moved to a new country. So I was reasonably sort of comfortable with insecurity, and I was reasonably comfortable with uncertainty. And I really wanted to stay in London. And I was really enjoying the teaching that I was doing. And so I just clung on. And the metaphor I used in the lecture I gave this week was like a dandelion, like with taproots into inhospitable soil. I just clung. And my friend and colleague and mentor, Jennifer Hudson, who introduced me the other night, somehow managed to get me a gig as what we call graduate tutor in the department, which was looking after the pastoral needs, the extenuating circumstances, attendance and all that kind of thing for our 500 a year postgraduate talk students. And that meant that I could make myself indispensable, right? And there's nothing better if you want a job than to be indispensable. So I did that for 7 years. It was a long time. I did that through the pandemic, which was hard work. So sitting on Zoom calls, watching people's lives fall apart was hard work. But I really liked it. I did a lot of teaching around the sides of that as well. But I was listening to students, getting involved in their lives, trying to help them figure things out, trying to support them, not just to get a degree, but to feel as if somebody cared about them and would listen to them. Nothing I haven't seen in those 7 years. It's just the law of big numbers, right? Addiction, pregnancy, homelessness, section under the Mental Health Act. Everything you can imagine. And as time went on, these jobs started to get regularised. And you started to see around the country sort of these 3-year teaching fellowships, that kind of thing. And I just seemed to me a really obvious improvised solution to a problem that we had, which is that we need people that are good at teaching in HE. We've got massively increased access to HE from when I was a student 30 years ago. We have lots of students coming. We have very high expectations from those students. They're very good students. They care, their parents care, the general public care about education in higher ed. And we hadn't been focusing on it. We've been focusing in research-intensive universities, very understandably, on research, and that's very demanding and it takes up a lot of people's time. And so we talk about research opportunities and we talked about teaching loads, right? Teaching burdens. And I sort of thought, this is the thing I'm good at, right? So my co-author, Ellen Watts, writes about this moment where you sort of think, well, if only this was a good job, right? If only this was a permanent job and a job where maybe one day I'll get paid a bit more or maybe get promoted and only people would respect me, then I wouldn't mind doing this. It'd be all right. What's not to like? You hang out with students. They're students that care about your discipline that you care about. They're motivated. They want to learn. You get to inhabit a university. You get to use the library. You get to carry on writing, either on your substantive research or, as I did, pedagogical research, right? Research into teaching and education. You get to, you get a lot of autonomy. You get a lot of choice in what you do. You get to enjoy your teaching. Why wouldn't that be a good job? Why wouldn't anybody envy me that job?
This is reminding me of David Graeber's distinction between like the bullshit job, which is just a terrible job and it's doing nothing for the world, and the shit job, which should be great, but just has terrible conditions.
Exactly.
Not the job. The job itself is good or the work is good.
And
the job
meaningful
is
work.
bad. And and it's meaningful and important that you're doing it.
Yeah.
But we put some stuff around it like insecurity and status that make it unattractive.
Exactly. And it wasn't even so much. So the money was kind of livable on, really, because we were getting paid at the same grade as our colleagues on research and teaching contracts. There were some issues around progression, but the money wasn't terrible. The insecurity is scary for lots of people, but for me, that wasn't the issue. For me, the issue was really respect, right? Do people think my work is meaningful? Can I be proud of myself? Are other people proud of the work that I'm doing? Because that's a question of how other people see us, which is sort of very important for humans who are social creatures. And then through the prism of how other people see us, like how do we see ourselves?
And are these the ideas you're exploring as well in your recent co-authored article, The Joy of the Teaching Track?
That's right. Yeah. So I wrote an article with, so it's Ellen Watts, Keith Smith, Rose Gann, Kalina Zhekova, who's our colleague in the department, and Madeleine Le Bourdon. And we are all teaching track people. And we've all been having these conversations about how much we like our jobs, how much we wouldn't like the other job, which is sort of sold to us as the promised land. So when people asked me how the job hunt was going, what they meant was, are you going to get a research and teaching job like your job, right? And those are cool jobs. Like, I absolutely understand why anybody would want a job like that, but those are amazing jobs. It wouldn't be the job for me, right? Actually, if I had the choice now to have one of those jobs or to have my job, I 100% would choose my job. And I think all my co-authors on that article would say the same thing. We love teaching. We love being part of a teaching community. We really enjoy getting together and talking about teaching. We love our students. Our work is in education. And we don't want to think about teaching loads. We want to think about the delight of education, the joy of it, how meaningful education is, how working with students is such fun. These are great jobs. And the only thing that makes them not great is if they're not treated with respect, or if the contractual stuff around them, the insecurity and all of that, which still exists in the sector, makes them less good jobs. Yeah.
Does the gendered aspect of these jobs trouble you a little bit? So an observation which I haven't carried out a proper study into is that it is predominantly women who are on the teaching track style job.
Yeah.
And there are more men, obviously, we know this, on research and teaching jobs. Does that worry you?
Yes. So now, in that article, we have some statistics on this, and it is true that women are overrepresented and that people of colour are overrepresented in these teaching jobs. Although that changes when you regularise them.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd say better jobs, surprisingly, than filled.
And the analogy is nursing, right? Nursing used to be an overwhelmingly feminised profession. And then it became professionalised and you needed a degree to do it. And suddenly men started flocking into nursing because it became an attractive job, right? And the same is true, I think, with teaching. So in the Political Studies Association Teaching and Learning Network, we have loads of men now. It's almost like we're almost getting to that problem of like, oh, the manel, we need to like find some women to sit on these panels. So it is true that women are socialised in a particular way and that teaching is understood to be a caring role, and we'll never completely get away from that. Women will be doing more service and more teaching until society as a whole changes. But I think once you get rid of that insecurity and precarity, then these jobs do become very attractive to men, and there are lots of great men doing them.
Fantastic to hear.
Yeah.
I guess one more small point of challenge, if I may. I mean, this is It's a funny moment here because I'm sitting here with my research and a teaching job, one of the old schools,
Yeah.
which I also know enough partly because of the joy of teaching, right? That is a large part of the job. And so I guess one thought is maybe you can spread that joy to the rest of us who also do research and see our research and teaching is much more aligned with each other. That was the old goal of research-led teaching, right? But the real question I had is a worry that a friend of mine who is president of his UCU branch at a university about to undergo swinging redundancies, massive cuts. Perhaps the institution would rather like it if we had teaching contracts. They don't have to pay for us to wander off into the weeds and see what we find in a way that doesn't produce anything that's productive to the university directly, that doesn't make money for the university in a way that students in those seats produces money.
Yeah.
Does that ever trouble you, that this is a kind of slippery slope to the kinds of cuts that are going on at some of these institutions, these Russell Group institutions?
Yeah, so it does. We have people who do research and teaching, but also really love teaching. I mean, I just think we're all a wonderful complement to each other, right? You need to have diversity in an institution, and different people will always want to do different things. So I would never want to do a job which was around, I don't know, alumni engagement or looking for philanthropy or something like that. But I've got colleagues that absolutely love that. That's great. I don't have to do it. They can do it. I've got colleagues that really love doing admissions and love to do an open weekend. Brilliant. You can do that. I'm happy not to do that. So I just think that's no problem.
Absolutely.
But when we're doing our research on the teaching track, perhaps we'll do more pedagogical stuff. And we might do more teaching over the course of the career. Then you have the power stuff and the money stuff. And I think that's right. And I know I always felt I was a member of the trade union. I'd be standing on picket lines and things. And I would be standing on picket lines with people who thought I shouldn't have the job that I had for all sorts of really good principled reasons, because they felt it was a way of eroding those kinds of research and teaching careers. And I think getting rid of the precarity, making sure education-focused people also have opportunity to wonder, making those jobs better is a partial answer to that, right? So one of the things we argue in the Joy of the Teaching Track article is we should also have time for research. We should also have time for thinking. We should also have access to sabbaticals, right? We shouldn't just... So one of the things, I sat in a meeting once very early in my career where somebody proposed that the main role of a teaching fellow, which is what we were called then, was to do his marking so that he could get on with his important research. That obviously plays into a sort of very neoliberal agenda of cuts and in a sector which is, I'm in a leadership role. Money's difficult. It's really, really hard. But if these are good jobs, then I don't think they compete with the research and teaching jobs. And I don't think anybody really wants universities that are not producing research. If we didn't have universities producing research, somebody would have to do the research. Everybody wants research. And what would we have to teach? And what would we look like as a country if we didn't have universities that were doing research? It's just it seems inconceivable to me, especially from where we are now, where research is this very dominant discourse. Actually, it's the power discourse. It seems very unlikely to me that we will end up in a situation where we just become big schools.
Let's turn to one of the core ideas of your inaugural lecture, this provocative idea of rewilding the university. So if any listeners might be disappointed by this, I was a bit disappointed by this. You said it wasn't to release badgers and wolves to the front quad, which, I mean, that would be fantastic. So what is it that we should do instead? What are we talking about when we're talking about rewilding this university?
Definitely not wolves. I was trying to think about rewilding as a kind of metaphor. So in the lecture, I talked a bit more length about regenerative farming and the way that they use nature. And the idea of rewilding really is that our relationship with nature it's out of hand in the way that we try and subdue and control and micromanage all processes of nature in order to have a beautiful garden or in order to produce food. And this is destroying the natural world. So Britain's one of the most nature-depleted countries in the world. And what rewilding advocates are doing is saying, actually, we can work with nature to have things like beautiful gardens and food production. And that works very well, and nature bounces back quite quickly. And if you just stop using weed killers, pesticides, fossil fuel inputs, micromanaging everything, the soil will come back to life. And then you will both make more money because you're not spending it on those inputs, and you will also be able to produce food and other good things, and nature will thrive, and you'll have things like nightingales. And the things that those regenerative farmers do, I sort of had it as bullet points, right? They put in some fencing, they put in some boundaries, but they also take a lot of boundaries out. They allow things to happen, they wait and see, they watch, they trust the process, they hold their nerve. So if it seems like brambles are taking over, they don't panic and start taking the brambles out. They just watch to see what happens with the brambles. Something else will come along, and they improvise, right? So there's always a kind of cobbled together solution, a bit like my career, really, sort of cobbling together these bits and bobs in order to come to a position where they can make the world more beautiful. And a lot of this is around storytelling as well, where we're sort of saying to people, what you thought neat and tidy and beautiful, that's not beautiful, this is beautiful. And so my argument really is that in the university, we've got into this state of learned helplessness, where every time we see a problem, we think, well, if only we could invent a rule or a regulation or a form or a box to tick, that would solve the problem. If only we could coerce the students a bit more, whether that's around attendance or handing their work in on time or learning the skills we want them to learn, or whatever that might be. If only we could coerce them a bit more with the promise of grades or the threat of sanctions, then we could solve our problems. And that looks remarkably similar to me to this command and control farming. And so what I'm trying to advocate is actually let's stop doing that and let's try and think of ourselves as educators, and let's see what grows if we just let go a bit. If we just release some of these rules and regulations, if we say to people, in your classroom, in your program, in your team, in your department, maybe you could do something interesting, maybe you could do something beautiful. We give you permission. Go for it. If it goes wrong, we'll hold our nerve, we'll trust the process, we'll improvise, and something will come along, right? And it will be all right. And I think if we did that, the university would really be a place where we're all here because we're interested in learning. We're all here because we're interested in ideas and in thinking together and in being together in community, rather than this kind of terrible fear that I think we're living in at the moment around these rules and regulations.
It's certainly true that our colleagues joining us from America are often quite startled by the extent to which the University Centre dictates what your course is going to look like, or the department dictates how they can be assessed and when you can change your mind about that and all sorts of things like this.
Yeah.
So is it that more freedom to the individual academic that you have as a picture? To experiment in their own classroom to see what works for them? Or are you seeing it as a more central process?
So I suppose there will be a role for the centre, right? So one of the arguments I made is you need some boundaries, right? So in a rewilded farm, you can't just have your belted Galloway cows kind of wandering off and going on the motorway. You have to have some boundaries. But the question is, where do you put the boundaries? And who's doing what with the boundaries? So the metaphor I use for my role, because I'm a sort of university leader, I'm one of these awful people that are in the centre, bossing everybody about, telling them what to do. And what I would like people like me to be in the role of is more like a wild gardener. So what wild gardeners do is they kind of allow things to grow and they sort of notice what's happening, and maybe they'll pull something out, or that maybe they'll put some diversity in. Putting diversity in is often very useful for ecosystems. But to sort of make the metaphor a bit concrete, in my role as a wild gardener, I do things like, with some of my colleagues in the department, we run the UCL Centre for the Pedagogy of Politics. I'm also a co-convenor of the Political Studies Association Teaching and Learning Network. And what we do in those spaces is we just get people together. So it's not so much the individual teacher, although individual teachers experimenting is fantastic, right? We need much more of that. And I think people often have this kind of sense of, I'd love to experiment, but I'm not allowed. And I want to give people permission to experiment on their own. But one of the ways you create that permission structure is we all get together in the CPP, in the TLN, and there are blogs that we write. There's all sorts of spaces that we've created where that ecosystem can start to flourish. And I've started to see, so over a sort of reasonably long career, I've started to see projects that I've started sort of popping up in other places. I was invited to give a talk yesterday in one of UCL's other departments outside our faculty. And I realised as I was arriving that the reason that they'd asked me was because they'd replicated a project that I'd done in this department, and they wanted me to come and talk to them about it. I hadn't even known that had happened. I've had colleagues at other universities talking about the way that I would chair a meeting and how they're going to chair a meeting in the same way now, in a more educational way rather than a sort of command and control way. So by creating these spaces, you sort of create the possibility for ecosystems to flourish and spread. That's kind of my vibe.
It's a wonderful vision. Let's make it really concrete. I want to talk about the command and control stuff that we do around grading, because I know this is one of your central interests, and you've just written, just literally yesterday, published an article against anonymity in grading. So that's why I guess there's a bit of context. Most of us, most of the time, do this in a pretty standard way, right? The student gives us an essay or an exam script. They're anonymous. We're anonymous. We give it a grade.
I could talk about this for a long time. So the thing about grading is we've started to use grades as a kind of way of disciplining students. You will notice that you say it all the time once you start becoming aware of it. We say to students all the time, if you do this, you'll get a good mark. If you don't do this, you'll get a bad mark. If you hand in late, you're going to lose 10 marks, right? It's this kind of tool to coerce and control. And there's quite a lot of literature on the way in which this creates really big problems in our classrooms. So students game the system. It really produces a lot of cynicism. Students become obsessed with grades, and that's partly because they're getting that message from us and their parents and wider society that the only thing that matters is the grade. Incidentally, isn't true, right? They've already won the golden ticket. They're at UCL. They're going to go out and get a job. That's fine, right? It's not true that a high grade in this particular 15-credit module will matter decisively to their lives or not. It means they hide their work from each other because they don't want to give anybody else an unfair advantage. It makes them competitive rather than collaborative. And it makes them mini-max. So students will focus in on one topic from your module because that's what they're going to write their essay on. And all they'll focus on is that. Maybe that's the only class they'll turn up to. And they'll really focus on that to get the grade rather than spending their time in that kind of zone of curiosity and learning and excitement. So there's a kind of movement around what we call ungrading, or at UCL we tried to call it freedom to learn, around just trying to slightly shift this obsession with grades and instead try to think about assessment as a process where students do some work and then they get some feedback, and that enables them to improve their work. And so what I've done, and I've done over the years, it's been a kind of long journey towards where I am now, but the practices that I describe in the anonymity article, students do some work and they do it across the term. It's not all at the last minute, and they can't do it on 1 week. They've got to work continuously. Then they get feedback. They get feedback from me and they get feedback from each other. And I have various tricks in order to make sure that they do get feedback from each other. And then they're allowed to revise their work on the basis of that feedback. They can carry on doing that as much as they like. There are they can get more feedback if they do certain things. And then at the end of term, they hand their work in, they fill in a questionnaire. The questionnaire has loads of questions on it, which are taken actually from Susan Bloom's excellent work on ungrading. And the questions are around the process of doing the work, effort that they've made, what they enjoyed, what they didn't enjoy, what they've learned. And then they tell me how well they've met the assessment criteria. And the assessment criteria are negotiable. So if they don't like those assessment criteria, we can have other ones, but that has to be agreed. And then they tell me what numerical grade they're going to get. And if they're in the right ballpark, and they should be because they've had feedback, they can have that grade.
That's a fascinatingly provocative alternative. So many interesting questions arise from it. Are you finding a gendered pattern in how they're assigning their grades?
Do you want me to talk about anonymity though?
Yes.
Then we'll talk about gender. So you cannot do this anonymously.
Right.
And people worry about awarding gaps, right? And so a gendered awarding gap, but also particularly racialized awarding gaps.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So when you say, is there a pattern, right? That's what people really worry about. And the thing that people have proposed, and this has come from students, actually, Wes Streeting, that loser, right? Yeah, he wrote a report when he was, I'm joking, Max, he's now health secretary. He wrote a report when he was president of the Students' Union around anonymous grading. So mark my work, not my name. And the contention is that if you don't know whose work you're marking, therefore there won't be awarding gaps.
You'll be fairer.
Because you'll be fairer because you don't know who it is. I mean, it's intuitively, it makes some sense. But it doesn't work like that in practice. There is absolutely no evidence. And there have been quite a lot of studies on this, including systematic studies. There is no evidence that anonymous marking makes any difference whatsoever to awarding gaps in either direction.
Fascinating.
Yeah. So something else is happening, right? And there's lots of research on why awarding gaps exist. And awarding gaps exist for all sorts of reasons around students not knowing how to do good work, students not knowing what good work looks like, students not understanding assessment criteria, not students from particular backgrounds not seeking, not going to office hours, not understanding how to interact with tutors, not working together in groups with other students. Whereas students from more privileged backgrounds will do these things instinctively because they were taught at school. So there's all sorts of stuff around hidden curriculum, which seems to be the real reason for awarding gaps. But if you're marking anonymously and you don't have a relationship with your students that's centred around the work and the feedback, because you can't, but you don't know who they are, and therefore you can't do any of the things that would address those hidden curriculum reasons, right? So my work cannot be anonymous, but it does address the actual reasons for awarding gaps, which are not that I happen to hate particular sort of students, but because those students don't know how to do the good work that they are capable of doing, because they, at the end, they got a place at UCL, they're capable of doing it for these other reasons. So I did have a look at this. My external examiner I've always had very supportive external examiners with this ungrading process, and I'm very grateful. And if you're listening, thank you. And also very supportive second markers. But that is the issue that comes up. Will you have awarding gaps? So I had a look, and because the students are anonymous,
It's really easy to tell.
And again, you can have the kind of, it's possible to have misidentifications, but I just broke down all the marks that the women were getting, the men were getting, the non-binary students were getting, and then the white students and the students of colour. And I did just basic mean, median, standard deviation, statistical significance. And there's very, very slight awarding gap, and it runs in favour of women, and it runs in favour of students of colour. But it's tiny. And according to my student who checked it for me, that is a statistically significant.
Absolutely fascinating. So there's a sort of call to all of us to do this stuff better. I guess what might people say back? I guess one thought people might have is that what would the other view be? The other view would presumably say something like, actually, we do at the end, even if not all the way through, want to know which of the students are performing at a much higher level than others. And some of them are. There is difference, there's variation, and there always will be. And there is such a thing as good work, and there is such a thing as poor work. And I guess they may be worried that removing all of the kind of command and control side of marking wouldn't give us enough space for that. Wouldn't give us enough space to really pick out the ones at the very top.
So I mean, there's a couple of things to say about that. So first, could we have an entirely ungraded degree? Yeah, they do it at Brown. There are ungraded paths. Often people think about it in terms of pass-fail. So there is a kind of a basic signalling function around effort, right? You can't just come to UCL and get a degree and never turn up and never do any work, right? Even the sort of hardest core ungraders will have pass-fail. I actually do have numerical marks in my class because I'm obliged to. It's just that the students help me decide what those numerical marks should be. So I'm like pretty vanilla in that way. But then there's the kind of, your question is, do grades fulfill a useful function? And I am increasingly convinced that they do not. So what grades tell us is who did the mini-maxing best, who played the game best, who was competitive, who didn't take a risk. So the students in my class, the risks they take, because it's low stakes, and the work they do as a result of taking those risks is often much, much better. I mean, I do still get students coming to my office house saying, what do I do in this class to get a good grade? What are you really looking for? And one student said to me, I just spent the whole term thinking, what does she want? And then I realised that the question is actually, what do I, the student, want? Right? And if I was an employer in a world of AI, in a world where ordinary, everyday administrative tasks are being increasingly automated, I would want a student who's creative, who's a risk taker, who is curious, who works hard, who's creative. And that's what ungrading can give us. And I don't think grading can give us those things. And the other thing to say is grading is very arbitrary as well. So we inhabit a contested discipline. I was also an undergraduate in a different contested discipline. And it is absolutely the case that people disagree on what good work looks like. So students come to me and sort of say, oh, am I allowed to use a first person pronoun in my essay? Am I allowed to say I argue? Because some of my tutors have deducted marks for this. I know. And rather than me saying, yes, you can for me, and I will reward that with a good grade, we talk about why some people like an objective, impersonal style, and some people, e.g. feminists, who think the personal is political, are very happy and very comfortable with a first person, more reflexive, more positional approach. And then we can say to the students, what do you think good work looks like? Do you think good work looks like this objective and personal approach? You know, maybe they do. That's fine. They get to decide. But then they understand that there are real philosophical reasons behind these differences within contested disciplines, rather than one person disciplining them one way and another person disciplining them the other way, and they don't know where to stand. And they don't understand why our behaviour is so irrational, Emily.
Before we run out completely of time, I would love to touch on that. Is such a provocative picture of how we could all do grading better. And certainly those of us facing a pile of more standard grading may wish to consider whether we could make our grading itself more joyful by taking up some of Cathy's wonderful suggestions. But I also wanted to touch a little bit about what happens in the classroom. So I have the joy of teaching many of the students that take also Cathy's modules. I think they like my emotions module, they like your nature model. I get a bunch of them together. So I wondered if we could just have a moment to touch on, I don't know, any of your chosen. So Cathy's particularly innovative. We've talked about going out into nature on a previous episode. But there's another idea that you've carried out, which you described as extended role play, which I would love to hear about because that is startlingly different to anything I've ever done.
Yes. So I actually, I'm not doing role play in the current module, the Politics of Nature module. But I previously had a kind of critical perspectives on international development module, which was heavily based on my previous career in the British Council, where I was working as a sort of international development project manager. So my students come to an international development class often with this kind of idea that they will go and work in international development and they'll go and sort of save people in other countries. I have real white saviour attitudes. And so I want to challenge that. I want to get them at least thinking a bit about whether that's where they want to be or not. And then you also get them coming to class and then complaining at the end of class that I didn't give them the magic answer to world poverty, couldn't fix it. And so that's another thing I want to challenge, right? This idea that you have that a democratic solution could be found if only you took my 50 credit module, and you would be able to go out and solve these issues, right? So I want to challenge all that, and I want to challenge it through the medium of like, this is what it's like to work in the actual world. And it started off as a kind of hour-long exercise in a seminar, and then it grew to a 3-hour exercise where I got the whole sort of module together to do this exercise, and it just kept growing. And by the end, I'd created this whole world with all these casts of characters, and it went on the whole term. And we had journalists reporting on the process. And the idea behind it was everybody was in groups. And the groups mapped onto the kind of networks and friendships that I'd observed within the class. And all the groups had a role. And what they had to do was prepare a presentation for the minister in a kind of big conference that we would have sort of halfway through, towards the end of the term. And so the minister was also a character in this, and the minister had their own team around them. So that was also a group. And the minister had to choose who to work with. And so they would give a presentation, they would each have an allotted amount of time for the presentation, and then the winner would be the one the minister chose. And the beauty of this was they could work together if they wanted. So anyone can work together with anybody else, it's totally up to them. So there is a win-win solution available in principle, is that the whole class can work together. They all go to the minister, they say, this is the answer, this is how we solve it, please work with all of us. Then they get all of the time because they can pool their time into the presentation and persuade the minister of the magic answer, right? You know, in simulations as in life, it's never happened because the game is rigged, right? So I tell the groups whether or not they speak English. I tell the groups who they have dinner with. I tell the groups who they went to university with. And we had chat rooms where people that couldn't speak English couldn't go in the English-speaking chat rooms, that kind of thing. I would introduce people to each other if it was useful for them to, if they were the sorts of people that might know each other in real life. Some of the groups were like totally socially excluded, didn't know anybody, I didn't help them at all. Then I would just show up and be sort of Mr. Biggins from the British Council, kind of getting drunk with them in a bar somewhere, but only the ones that drank, right? And giving them gossip. So some would get gossip, some wouldn't get gossip. Sometimes I'd sort of say to them, oh, you know, the minister is like partial to a crumpled fiver. I don't know if you've thought about that. Right. And then the minister also had all these things that they were interested in. So, you had international donors in the mix as well. So the international donors are interested in the Sustainable Development Goals, and they're interested in pushing the minister about a bit. But the minister also has some power in this situation. Then you've got a group of religious leaders who are also interested in pushing the minister about a bit. And incidentally, the minister needs to get elected. And so usually it was the minister. So she would be interested in working with the religious leaders. And then the religious leaders also spoke the local language, so they could coalition build with the local people. And so there's all this stuff going on, right? And it was such fun. And then the group of journalists who were often students that were interested in journalistic careers would report on it. And then all the class could read the reports from the journalists online, unless they didn't speak the language that the journalists were writing. And it was just amazing fun. And it was all ungraded.
And I take it that at the end they had a better sense of the complexities of trying to get across any of these policies in the government now.
Absolutely. And so they said two things. So first of all, they said, it's really eye-opening how much power so this is the politics department. And they learned from that exercise how much power is going on, right? There are power relations happening at all levels of these kinds of interactions and negotiations. But the other thing, which was particularly heartwarming, was one student said, change can happen. It's possible to change things. There's room for manoeuvre in all these situations. There are the possibilities of win-wins. It's just really hard. You have to work at it.
Fantastic. On that note, that's the perfect ending. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast and offering us your provocative and insightful ideas about the university and the ways that we should probably all go about changing our teaching practices. Links to the articles we've discussed can be found in the show notes for this episode. And I would say that we've only sort of gone across the top of some of the innovations that you've enacted. Another one I just want to note just before we close off is the wonderful inclusive curriculum project, about which I will also add a link in the episode notes for anyone who wants to have a look at the wonderful work that Cathy has also been doing on diversity and inclusion. We're going to return after Easter with the next series. Remember, to make sure you don't miss out on future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Google Podcasts, or whatever podcast provider you use. And while you're there, we'd love it if you could take a moment of your time to rate or review us too. I'm Emily McTurnan. This episode was produced by Eleanor Kingwell-Banham. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.